My name is Marco Conadiaqua. I am Deputy Director at Transportation Alternatives in New York City. Just a brief introduction of what we do, who we are. So Transportation Alternatives, or TA, was established in 1973. Our mission is to reclaim New York City streets from cars and advance walking, biking, and public transit for all New Yorkers. We have a presence in all 5 boroughs in New York City: Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Staten Island, Queens, and we are organizing to achieve that mission. I am very grateful for the panelists that have joined us today: State Senator Jessica Ramos, Dr. Do Lee of CUNY and Biking Public Project, and Denzel Singletary of Postmates. Today we'll be discussing 2 intersecting issues. One, e-bikes and to some extent e-scooters in New York City, including the efforts to legalize them and how these micromobility devices and solutions can help transform the transportation landscape. And 2, the rights of overwhelmingly immigrant delivery workers in New York City and the targeted policing against them by the NYPD, instigated by the New York City mayor in 2017. Before we begin, I want to take a brief moment to acknowledge the moment that we're in. We have a crisis of a pandemic, and then we are living through protests born out of the killing of Black people, of which Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and others are only the most recent tragedies of the entrenched systemic racism in our country. And for many, this is an awakening. And for many of us, what is happening on our streets is also a painful reminder of the racism that we have experienced. And I want to acknowledge the moment that we are in and how some of these issues are often very difficult and painful for many of us to engage with. There is a particular connection from this to e-bikes and delivery workers in New York City, with heavy-handed policing against immigrant Latino and Asian American men. One of our panelists coined the term Vision Zero Apartheid to describe an element of this. So before I introduce each panelist, I just want to give an overview of today's discussion. So each panelist will give brief introductory remarks, no more than 3 minutes each. And then I will pose some questions for the panelists to have a discussion for about 25 minutes. And then we will have Q&A and I invite all of you to post questions in the chat. So joining us, about 3 panelists, is State Senator Jessica Ramos. Senator Ramos represents New York State Senate District 13 in Queens and is the chair of the Committee on Labor. She's the first American born in her family, a strong union advocate, and is passionate for activism and public service. In just 1 year, she championed the state legislation to legalize e-bikes, e-scooters, and a Farm Workers' Rights Act. Dr. Do Lee is an assistant professor at Queens College Department of Urban Studies. His research interests critically examine the interrelationships of people, mobility, environment, and social justice, including a dissertation that focused on participatory action research with immigrant food delivery cyclists in New York City to examine the mobility and working experiences of these workers. Denzel Singletary with Postmates joined Postmates as the senior manager of government relations in 2019 and is based in San Francisco. His department oversees the company's legislative and regulatory program focused on the future of work, privacy, robotics, innovation, and how tech intersects with our communities. So now I want to give it over to each of our 3 panelists to give brief introductory remarks, starting with Senator Ramos. then Dr. Doe Lee, and then Mr. Singletary. Senator?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon to everyone. Marco, thank you for such a nice introduction, but also for bringing us together to continue the conversation because, as we well know, our economy is rapidly changing. Even before the pandemic, we saw how the quote-unquote digital marketplace is redefining the way people work. And certainly there are going to be changes that come out of our collective experience through this pandemic, where we realize more people are able to work from home. We realize that we depend much more on delivery workers who should be afforded the same benefits and rights than every other essential worker. And so to me, that work is critical, of course, not only because so many delivery workers are my neighbors, but because in my district, we rely on restaurants and on our street vendors, our vibrant food scene to help our working families survive. I think I'm very proud of the work that we did within the past year to make sure that we were legalizing e-bikes, not just for the delivery workers, of course, but because we see micromobility as an answer to the carbon emissions that are emitted by cars, are polluting our air and are causing asthma in many of the communities, including mine, particularly in Astoria. And so I've really looked at the e-bike issue from those different angles. Yes, it's a labor issue, it's a transportation issue, it's an environmental issue, it's a health issue. We need to start offering alternatives to people so that we can start changing car culture. And for that, well, I'm deeply indebted, of course, to transportation alternatives, but Dr. Doe Lee, whose work I admire so much. I mean, just aside from a brilliant mind, a natural organizer who really helped us galvanize the power of our Asian, our Latino delivery workers to make sure that they have a voice. And that needs to continue based on our experience during this pandemic. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator, for those kind words as well, and thank you, Marco, and everyone for making the space available. Coming into this, I keep thinking a couple years back when Edwin Ajacolon was killed by a speeding driver. He was a 14-year-old Guatemalan immigrant who had come the year before, traveled thousands of miles to very precarious conditions to come to this country, and he was delivering food on an e-bike. And I remember from the Ghost Bike ceremony, Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams spoke about Ajacolon and talking about how he was seeking the American dream. And I just thought that was always such a weird way to put it, that traveling so far when you're 14 years old and to deliver our food, to raise money to send to your family. I mean, that's violence. That's not a dream. And the way that folks are policing this, it's fundamentally, I think at this moment is thinking about how we create systems to create violence through policing systems, through our systems of migration, dislocation, exploiting workers. As Senator Ramos mentioned, this is a safe streets issue. This is a policing issue. This is a human migration issue, and this is a system of global capitalism that creates these kind of workers and sends a 14-year-old boy thousands of miles from his home. And I think my own family. I had forgotten in much of this work until I think a rally with Senator Ramos, where I remembered that my father, when he first moved to this country, one of his first jobs was to deliver for a pharmacy in Los Angeles, and it made me realize how much this work had such deep meaning for me. That the way we had a lot of people had demonized delivery workers was demonizing my own father and people like him. it's not so much that they're good or bad people, but they're people. And so I think that's the thing I want to kind of center here. And as we kind of think about, talk about the future of e-bikes, we want to center people, not necessarily the mode. We want to center people. Thank you.
Hey everyone, Denzel Singletary here from Postmates. I just want to first of all thank Marco for convening this conversation and really kind of dive into piggyback off of Senator Ramos. Really talking about the intersectionality of how e-bikes, touch labor, they touch health, and back to kind of Dr. Dolee, the human aspect. When I came to Postmates and I left Capitol Hill from working with Senator Gillibrand, I wanted to go somewhere where people came first. Come somewhere where people were actually a part of the process of what we were doing. And so when we talk about this idea of low barrier of entry work, this idea where, you can make money without having things like a car or having to have some sort of capital to put into a situation or a business, we need to have those resources available to people. And so when I look at our e-bike situation, whether we talk about New York or in other places, I really look at this as a way for us to have a low barrier of entry for people to have access to work. Senator Ramos talked about the asthma issue in New York. I'm from Buffalo, and I have asthma, and grew up in the inner city of Buffalo. And when we talk about how cars are polluting our air, and how these whether we talk about scooters or bikes as a mode of transportation, or and specifically to Postmates as a mode of delivering food and making money, we need to make sure these barriers are removed. I know we're going to talk a little more about it later in the conversation about, what New York is doing and what's kind of happening across the country. But I really think it's important for us to look at it from this human aspect. How are we removing these barriers? How are we making sure people have access to these instruments? And, for Postmates, I know when we initially developed our partnership with Marco, it was, we're hearing this from our fleet in New York. We're hearing about the stolen bike issues. We're hearing about the racist police tactics when it comes to e-bikes and people having access to the bikes or getting their bikes ticketed or stolen, the road conditions. And so although Postmates, and I can't even say me, because again, I'm 6 months in. So although Postmates may be an expert when it comes to the mechanism of delivery and connecting people to places, you all are a leader in the space of e-bikes and e-scooters. And as a resource for our fleet, we wanted to combine those two efforts to make sure we're getting the most pertinent information and that we have people fighting for our fleet. So happy to be a part of this conversation. Really excited about this panel of excuse my French, kick-ass people. And I'm looking forward to having this conversation today.
Thank you, Denzel, Doe, and Senator Ramos. So Doe, just starting with you and thinking of the moment that we are in, what corollaries do you see from the policing that we're seeing now against protesters, about who is being policed, and the policing that we've seen against food delivery workers using e-bikes?
Well, I think obviously we have to be a little bit cautious here. The protests have been about Black lives, right? And we don't want to necessarily appropriate that for other kinds of policing, although they are intertwined and related for sure. And in a sense, what immigrant delivery workers have experienced is what scholars have talked about in terms of the origins of policing here in the United States, that they fundamentally originate from policing slavery, right? Slave patrols, from colonial relationships, whether both here in the United States of settler colonialism in displacing indigenous, native, and Mexican populations from the North America. And also, lastly, control the industrial working class. And so a lot of people have talked about this, and in a sense, immigrant delivery workers kind of sit at an intersection of all three of these. And if we look at the history of immigrant workers in global capitalism, what happened in kind of imperial colonial relationships, a lot of Western Europe, American kind of forces went into parts of Asia, other parts of the world, to just kind of dislocate people through these kind of arrangements. And so a lot of, I guess, disposable people were created in this process who were forced to migrate. It's happened in South and Latin America. And so when you see a lot of the people who migrate, scholars have documented this, that they're not necessarily the poorest of the poor. They're middle-class people who are dislocated from their homes. And so, and that it creates this kind of disposable labor. And so, so when we think about where and how these workers are produced, it is in kind of in service of these systems, and in order to manage these systems and to make people disposable, we create systems of policing to do so. And so we create systems of policing to control the working class. We create systems of policing to produce these people. And so, and both alongside the imperial kind of military presence we have overseas. And I'll give a specific example. I've been reading Lisa Lowe's work, who's a scholar who talks about racial capitalism and how it interlocks Europe, Africa, and Asia, and how European interests had dislocated Chinese workers in Hong Kong and created basically a coolie class to be exported to replace slaves. And we know the history of the import of coolies, these kind of disposable, low-wage Asian workers, was as a means to say, hey, we don't want to pay slaves, basically. And we think about the origins of in the United States of the word of the tipping practice. Well, tipping originated in the United States as a practice to not pay freed slaves either. The first people to be tipped basically were Pullman railway workers who were freed slaves, and because no one wanted to pay them, they just wanted to create a system of control. So these are all systems of control, and it interlocks with what's happening now because these things have remained and changed and evolved, but they still exist in different forms of fashions.
Thank you, Do. And Jensel, how do delivery workers fit into Postmates' current structure and your vision for the future?
Just have to say I'm very proud of myself for remembering to hit unmute before talking. That's been like a struggle of mine throughout this whole new work from home situation. But as far as delivery workers and kind of where they fit into Postmates, I mean, there is no Postmates without our fleet. And it was so interesting when COVID initially happened, and now, fast forward to what we're talking about when we talk about George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, or if we want to take it back and talk about Mike Brown, our fleet is always kind of at the forefront, which is why we established our Fleet Advisory Board. So essentially what that is our Postmates who are super tied into the fleet community, not only have their pulse on what's happening, but are also delivering. And so having those people as a resource for me has been very helpful, because that is a way that I know kind of what things we need to be doing in New York or whatever market. So for example, the reason why we came into this partnership with you all, Marco, was because we heard from our fleet that they're dealing with all these different issues when it comes to their bikes. Rather we talk about bikes, like I said, being stolen, rather we talk about road conditions, rather we talk about having access to affordable fixing of bikes issues, like we realized that we needed to have a partnership specifically in New York that was dealing with our fleet and their different bike issues. And so when we talk about how important the fleet is to Postmates, I mean, they are the bed of Postmates. I mean, without people there to deliver the goods, there is no delivery of the goods. And so, you know, they're integral, and that is why, you know, partnerships like this are so important.
Thank you. And Senator Ramos, can you speak more to what really motivated you to carry the legislation that passed both chambers in the New York State Legislature yet last year to legalize e-bikes and e-scooters?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I first became aware of the issue when I was working in the de Blasio administration and the crackdown began. And that, of course, immediately sent some shivers down my spine. And I decided that upon running for office, it would be critical to talk about those marginalized communities, including worker sectors that are predominantly people of color, whose working conditions are not prioritized very often. And we mentioned some of them before, right? Even the conditions of the roads, making sure that delivery workers are actually getting the tips that are given to them, making sure that they're being paid by the hour. All of these things, in addition to many more, are really critical. And now that I'm labor chair, that really is the lens through which I see this. And this is a discussion that I've brought up with Postmates and other apps over time, over the last few months, is the idea that if they're a worker, then they should be afforded the same rights that every other worker in New York is given. The right to a day off, the right to collectively bargain, the right to access to unemployment benefits and workmen's compensation should they get hurt on the job. All of these things are critical in the way we classify those workers. And so here we see a slight split or division in this workforce, because of course, if you work for a restaurant, it's very different than whether you work for an app. If you work for a digital application like Postmates, you may be qualified as an independent contractor. And many people feel that there are positives to that classification. But overall, what we've seen in many different sectors of work is that it's critical, especially because it might be a more newcomer population, that they are able to reinforce their human rights through their worker rights. And that's really been my inspiration. I mean, you mentioned it before, I'm the daughter of immigrants. I know what it's like for my parents to be undocumented. And so many of my peers and the children in my district depend on delivery workers for the sustenance that they need. So my commitment is to make sure that we are solving these issues for delivery workers, and that we are respecting their work in a way that recognizes their sacrifice and compensates them appropriately. This is why we have to do away with the tipped wage. This is why, in my opinion, we should peg the minimum wage to inflation, so that our communities of color can continue to thrive.
Thank you. And on that, and just I want to ask you a question, Doe, about the experiences of delivery workers in the city, specifically, basically their work conditions in general, and also the policing that they have experienced. And just for our viewers, just to give a bit of context here, in New York State, we did not have e-bikes or e-scooters legalized until this year. There had been an effort underway for a long time, but had failed. Meanwhile, at least 30 other US states had legalized e-bikes in some form. In 2018, the city of New York did legalize pedal assist e-bikes of the kind that were used by our bike share system, City Bike. But throttle e-bikes, the kind used by most food delivery workers, were not legalized and were still illegal under state law, as the pedal assists were also under state law, with the exception of New York City. Joe, can you speak to what workers have been experiencing?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think in the research that we did, we basically saw three key concerns that workers raised. One was about labor conditions, very exploitative. Hardly any of them get workers' compensation or health. No one gets health insurance. And this is a dangerous job. We are finding injury rates that were 20 to 45 times as the national rate. And so, and when you get hurt, you can't make wages. And so we were seeing that workers, on top of that, especially the immigrant workers, were getting paid less. Spanish and Chinese speaking workers were getting paid about $9 to $10 an hour, and that includes tips. And so, so the labor exploitation was a big part of it. Street safety was a big part of it too. So part of that is also, getting hit by cars. That's a huge problem for any working cyclist, but also just the risk of robbery and assault on the job. And that never gets talked about in terms of safe streets for working cyclists. I think it was, I forget the number, but the majority of the delivery workers we spoke to had been robbed or assaulted at least once on the job. And 2/3 of them have never reported that to the police, mainly because of fear about the police. And that fear really gets to the third thing that they were so vocal about, was the conditions of policing that they endured. That was the primary thing, and that actually surprised us. A lot of us came into this research thinking that, oh, it'll probably be about safe streets, and this is a safe streets issue for them, but it was not in the way that we kind of conceptualize it typically, through kind of like a privileged kind of like we love bike lanes kind of mentality. You can't have safe streets with over policing. You can't have safe streets with this kind of system, and workers talked about getting so many tickets from the police, being harassed. In 2017, 2018, over 2,100 electric bikes were confiscated by the NYPD, mostly from delivery workers, and these are usually owned by the delivery workers and not the employer, because of the way employers externalize the cost onto workers. So that's how these things also interlock. But because of the way the law was kind of were written, it was legal to own an electric bike in New York State, but illegal to ride, which made no sense, and it put workers like this in a no-win situation. And so a lot of what we heard was, why are they doing this to us? We're just trying to do our jobs. We're just trying to bring people their food. Why are they harassing us for doing our jobs? And I think the last piece of this, I don't want to get too much, go too long, but was that the workers' voices weren't being heard on this. We also did an analysis of media stories over a 10-year period, talking about delivery workers, and we found that 3/4 of the stories about delivery workers in New York City didn't include a quote from a delivery worker in those stories about them. So largely their stories were being told by more privileged people who were demonizing them. And so I think the one key takeaway is like, well, where are the worker voices? And so that was prompted our research was, well, we need to hear from the workers. What do they care about? What are their desires? What are their dreams? What are their imaginations? And I mean, I think that's the most important thing to think about. And the last example I'll give is after a lot of this e-bike crackdown kind of got initiated at the behest of Matthew Scheffler, who got on the Brian Lehrer show. And then the mayor heard this and he's like, oh, that's a great idea. We need to crack down on electric bikes. We raised such an uproar that the Brian Lehrer show actually had me on to kind of put a counter narrative to this. And so after the show, after I was interviewed on it, the show assistant came up like, oh, I wish that a delivery worker had called in to you raise a point or ask a question. And I was like, they don't listen to your show. And so I think we have to question, like, when we're having these conversations, who are we including and who are we excluding, and how we define legality, illegality, who's good, who's bad. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm sure others have lots to say.
Thank you, Joe. Senator Ramos, I do want to get to you on how delivery workers, working cyclists could potentially benefit from some of the protections that you've highlighted with your work, your Farm Workers Act, and the potential of something like that happening on the state front for working cyclists. For those who joined to learn more technical details about what may have passed in New York State for e-bikes and e-scooters, I just want to briefly address that earlier this year, as part of the budget negotiation process, the governor, the Senator Ramos, Assembly Member Neely Rosich, and advocates basically were able to get through legalization of e-bikes in New York State, where 3 classes of e-bikes were legalized. Class 1, which are pedal assist e-bikes that provide motorized propulsion only when you pedal and only up to 20 miles per hour, after which you have to pedal faster with your own 2 feet if you want to go faster. Class 2 e-bikes were legalized, which also can only go up to 20 miles per hour, but can have a throttle as well that you can operate similar to a moped. And then a 3rd class of e-bikes were legalized that can be also with a throttle that can go up to 25 miles per hour. And they were legalized only in New York City, recognizing that that is the type of e-bike class 3 in New York City that's different from the class 3 that is in most other states. But that is the type of e-bike that was used by the vast majority of New York City's 30,000 plus food delivery workers who use e-bikes, and there are estimates that there are more than 40,000 food delivery workers in New York City, and even more working cyclists. And then e-scooters were also legalized, including the opportunity for localities to legalize e-scooter share as well. So that's just broadly speaking where we are now on the legalization front. Denzel, going off what Doe described with the conditions that workers are facing, the unfair labor practices, what can you talk about what can be done to address that? And I would particularly love to hear about the legislation that just recently passed in New Jersey to set up protections for gig workers and portable benefits for them, and maybe also speak to why that you believe that is a solution.
Yeah. So first of all, I think what Dr. Doley said was spot on, and also kind of highlights. Well, not kind of highlights it. It specifically highlights why it's so important for us to be in such close contact with our fleet advisory board, because again, I am in San Francisco, so therefore I don't have visibility into every market of how the conditions are, or what specifically people are dealing with in New York that they may not be dealing with in Connecticut or in Seattle. And so, when we set up this fleet advisory board and we were hearing things about, folks being hurt on the job, that is why we implemented occupational accident insurance for our fleet. And again, we're an industry leader in doing that. And then most folks followed. I'm not sure who does and who doesn't have it, but, that was one of the reasons why we did it, because to Dr. Doley's point, if you're hurt on the job, you should have some sort of way of recuperating, what you were making if you are hurt, and also having help with your medical bills. So how can we as a company, again, be working with our fleet and having our fleet be a major part of our model without them having that protection and feeling like they have that protection in case anything happens? And so that is why we did that. Also, we were the first to implement a child care credit again, because we were hearing from our fleet that people have kids and COVID is hitting hard. Because there are more people on the platform now trying to deliver, wages may be going down. So how can we help and kind of be that gap? When we talk about, occupational health insurance, talk about childcare, also talking about making sure folks have paid leave if in fact something happens for us right now, COVID related, to have that time to self-quarantine and not have to worry about losing your wages in that meantime. So those are just a few things that we've been working on internally and rolling out internally as a result of A, what we thought, but B, what we confirmed with our fleet advisory board. In regards to the portable benefits, that model has been something that we've been exploring internally for quite some time, which is why when Senator Troy Singleton introduced that legislation, I actually went down to Jersey and testified on behalf of Postmates as to why a portable benefit structure is a good route for this. And all that to say, because there are people who are working, and I remember this from actually my first conversation with Senator Ramos, and she brought up to me the fact that there are people who are working on several different platforms throughout the day. How do we make sure they're protected throughout the day? And if there's certain things that Postmates is offering, like I said, our occupational health insurance, but you may not, be working for us when you get hurt. How are you covered? How are we making sure these people have these protections? And so the idea of portable benefits kind of came about because it makes sense. And that is why we have been so supportive of Senator Singleton. And I have to call out Senator Ramos again for bringing industry to the table when we have these conversations, because I can't speak for everyone, but I can speak for Postmates in the sense that, we are trying to figure out these solutions in good faith. And we do have our fleet at the forefront when we're talking about these things. When we talked to the Fleet Advisory Board about portable benefits and walked them through what that structure would look like. When we talked to our fleet specifically in New Jersey, and talked about, Senator Singleton, who also is a big labor proponent, what this would look like, we felt that it made sense. And that's why we got involved. And like I said, I testified, and why we've been supportive of Senator Singleton and continuing that dialogue.
Thank you, Denzel. And since we're on the topic of State Senator Ramos, apparently, Senator, can you speak briefly to, and before we get to take some questions from the chat box, can you speak briefly to how either existing legislation or existing state law or potential future law or existing legislation could be made to benefit workers?
So how I mentioned before, my priority is largely first and foremost to make sure that people are protected at work. So making sure that they have access to health care in case they get hurt, making sure that their working conditions are adequate, that they're given the equipment that is needed, and of course that they're able to have a voice on the job. And while advisory councils can be very valuable, we know that it is critical for there to be a collective bargaining unit that speaks for a group of workers and is able to come to an agreement with their employer about how much to get paid, whether they need child care, how it is that they can achieve these things in a way that really does address their needs. And so one thing that we haven't talked about yet here that I think is very relevant is sectoral bargaining. And that's something that my team and I have started to look into to try and understand whether it is a mechanism that could be very helpful in certain industries, especially those who, how can I put this, have various different types of employers. So, obviously, because there's either restaurants or apps, and then there's Denzel mentioned, there are folks who can work for many, many apps, but they should still be able to do their job safely. And that's really critical. So that, to me, a bill like the Farm Workers Bill, and for those at home who don't know, last year I passed the Farm Worker Fair Labor Practices Act. And believe it or not, it granted farm workers for the very first time in the state of New York the right to collectively bargain, the right to a day off, the right to unemployment and workers' compensation benefits, things that every other New Yorker is afforded but hadn't been done. Farm workers were purposefully left out of the New York Constitution because at the time, farm workers in New York State were mostly Black. Those labor protections weren't given to Black farm workers because they were seen as less than. And so that tradition had continued to permeate. Of course, today, most farm workers are Latino, like me, mostly Mexican, mostly Guatemalan, but still a sizable amount of folks who are coming over from Jamaica or from Haiti to help us pick apples and things like that. And so I don't want to digress too much, but in thinking about how that labor market functions, what we're looking to do is make sure that the same basic protections are given to delivery workers who have had very little visibility, as Dr. Lee pointed out, especially in the media over time, and who may feel scared to speak up for themselves, not only because of negative interactions with police officers, but because so many of them are undocumented and live with fear of placing themselves or their families in danger because they're actually the main breadwinners. There's just so much to do. I mean, we mentioned the tipped wage, we mentioned all of these benefits, and what we want to do, of course, is make sure that in this way, what we're doing is elevating the work and therefore helping the employers hopefully provide a better service. It was why it was so critical in negotiating that farm workers bill that we actually had the farm owners, the farmers, the Farm Bureau in this case, at the table, because we want to continue or to start nourishing a real relationship where workers are respected. And so I'm very fortunate, you know, that I was able to count on Neely Rozick's leadership in the assembly in order to get this done. I mean, it kind of is inexplainably, it was inexplainably quick to pass within a year, considering we're talking about Albany. But it was because it was a major bipartisan approach. If you look back when we passed the bill last year, many Republicans voted for our bill because they understood many of these critical points, believe it or not. And so we need to continue to figure out how it is that we can work towards a more equitable workplace and making sure that we're putting workers' voices first.
Thank you, Senator. So we just under 20 minutes left, and want to go to questions from the chat box. Denzel, you had a quick point?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick point because I totally forgot to do this when we were initially talking in regards to tipping. And talk about, because to me, the whole tipping structure, specifically in the gig economy, was off the railroads. And having tipping be a part of the hourly wage, all those things to me are egregious. I mean, again, yes, I'm at Postmates now, but I, you know, worked in Democratic politics for years before I even came over to this. So like that whole idea has always been really strange to me. And so when I got to Postmates and, you know, first of all, I had to check the box to make sure we weren't stealing tips or making tips a part of, you know, an hourly wage, which we weren't, thank you. But it was also important to do two things. When we talk about how tipping works in the app, making it a prompt, not something that is optional, but making it a prompt so that people see, oh, I can tip the worker who just delivered this food to me, and not just, add $1 or $2, but like actually tip on the order. So that was important, and what I thought we needed to continue making it prompt. Also, when we had industry colleagues who were using tips to make up an hourly wage and were taking tips from workers, we called them out. And I thought that was important. It was important for us to not only show our industry colleagues that, A, that's not okay, but also to show our workers, we stand with you. And so you may be experiencing these egregious conditions when it comes to tipping and other apps, but not only are we not going to do it here, but we're not going to stand for it. And so I think it's important when we talk about as an industry and we talk about standards, whether we talk about tipping, occupational health insurance, childcare, various things that a lot of our workers are dealing with and our fleet are dealing with, to make sure that we're holding our industry counterparts accountable and making them come to the table with us and also offer these same type of things.
Thank you, Denzel. So Dr. Lee has been answering some questions in the chat box. He's on double duty. Thank you, Do. A question is, what is the timeline for legalizing e-scooter share programs at the local level, and are they legal in any municipality yet? I can speak briefly to that and say that there was a timeline of about 3 months before they took the legalization actually took effect, and it is up to each locality to take proactive action, essentially, in passing local laws to legalize e-scooters. I'm not aware of any e-scooter share programs authorized in New York State yet, but do any of our panelists have anything to add to that?
No, I think that the only thing to add is perhaps the next steps, and I'm sure with transportation alternatives, we're going to work very closely with the New York City Council to make sure that we are enacting any other protections and any other clarification there is needed, so that it is irrefutable that these workers are essential workers and that they are to be respected, not harassed by the police, as we work to defund the police and fix that sort of bit. And so I think that's where the next level of talking about legalization of these vehicles, or of these micro mobility vehicles will certainly, or should, I should say, should certainly lead to upgrades in infrastructure that allow for them to feel more protected. And I too read some of the questions, and I know somebody asked about bike lanes for those who want to go a little faster, for example, which I think is critical, right? Actual real protected bike lanes are also a very serious life-saving measure. And these are all investments that the city of New York should have done and should be making right now. So I don't know if somebody from the mayor's office is listening. Hi, Senator Ramos here. We need more bike lanes, and we need bike lanes for our e-bikes so that our folks, our delivery workers, are able to ride safely in the street, keeping pedestrians safe too.
Thank you, Senator. And on that issue of bike lanes, of keeping people safe, investing in safe infrastructure, it reminds me of Vision Zero. And though I mentioned at the top of this hour the term that you had coined, Vision Zero apartheid, which is an entirely uncontroversial term, could you speak to what you mean by Vision Zero apartheid?
Well, I think fundamentally, what's rooted in is how we define public safety and from whose imagination it springs from. Largely, at least here in the U.S., in New York, we have defined public safety through the definitions of privileged white people. This Vision Zero apartheid, the segregation, basically what it is a segregation of safety, how we define safety. And the reason I bring this up is how Vision Zero had really centrally positioned enforcement as one of his pillars. So basically what I argue is that when you mix public safety initiatives through something like Vision Zero, and you include policing in the mix in a racist society, what happens is Vision Zero or public safety programs get repurposed to actually create public safety, but to be repurposed to calm white fears about non-white people in their space, and to impose punitive forms of racial and social control, but using the argument of public safety. And we can even kind of see this in how Mayor de Blasio deployed the police in terms of social distancing, right? This idea that they were gonna protect us from COVID when they're actually just arresting mostly Black folks and brown folks, right? And so this was giving the police carte blanche to say, we're doing this for public health. And so, so I think what I want to kind of get at is how we think about public safety. And a lot of, and I'm not an expert on this, I'm still learning, but about the idea of prison and police abolition. And a lot of people who have written about this talk about this as not an absence. I think the way this is often framed as, oh my God, we're defunding the police, we're eliminating, like, what do we do then? And the people who talk about this is not about an absence. This is about presence. This is not about just closing or ending these systems. It's about supporting and creating systems that actually give life, that support the communities that we want, that support the people in the ways they need: healthcare, education, safe streets. And when I think about delivery workers, I don't necessarily think it's the healthiest thing to create a system in which we're constantly encouraging people to speed up their bodies all the time. I don't think that's particularly safe or healthy for workers. And I think what that is a canary in the mine, in the mine, right? It's all of us are being constantly told within this economy to constantly speed up our bodies endlessly, and to our detriment of our health. And delivery workers are kind of like the tip of the spear in that sense. They are constantly told to speed up, or you lose your jobs. You don't get paid. You don't get tips. And I don't think that's healthy. And I think if we're going to talk about how we think about safety, we have to think about, okay, it's not just about eliminating things, but how do we create presence of the things that we need? How do we support workers with the supports that they need? How do we create conditions where we go more slowly through the streets? So it is safer. Not just simply saying you're going to be policed because our conditions of labor require us to go fast. So I think we have to think about simultaneously, what are it's not just about abolishing things, but how do we create supports for people and what they need? So that's where I'm gonna hand it off.
Thank you, Joe. Denzel or Senator Ramos, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. I think.
Yes, I do.
Okay, Senator.
There's a lot going on in my house. Well, I'm not actually home. I'm in Albany, but I brought my kids with me. So remote learning is happening at the same time. So my apologies if it sounds a little crazy over here. I really appreciate Dr. Lee's comments, because I think that many people aren't understanding what we mean when we say defund the police. I mean, how is it that we're going to keep immigrant delivery work or delivery workers safe, right? We've stated during this panel that one of the biggest dangers of the job is getting, assaulted, robbed by someone. And so how are we dealing with those crimes? And the idea behind defunding the police is that we are taking money away from that budget to put it into things like education and healthcare, where they're sorely needed in order to prevent crime. People commit crimes largely for two reasons. One, mental illness. Two, economic necessity. Or I would say argue three, that there's also maybe a personal conflict, because, for example, right now there are lots of concerns around shootings in New York City, but they're mostly targeted, which means that we need to do a better job teaching conflict resolution, which means that we need to do a better job of making sure that everyone has a job that can help them sustain their families, right? And this idea of the minimum wage, I have an issue with the word minimum. It means that it's what, the bare cost of living for you? I mean, wasn't that the argument that the slave masters had for providing, living quarters and clothes and very limited food for the slaves? We have to evolve from that. And so I see this in that way, in the way that we must recognize that it is not enough to survive. All people should have the right to earn wages to thrive for a better tomorrow, so that supposed American dream can someday actually be reached. So I just want to caution, because I know for many can still sound radical, but the truth is that we just don't need a person with a gun at all times.
Thank you. And I'm very happy that we are discussing such light topics as slavery and Vision Zero, apartheid, to close this with. Denzel, we have about 3 minutes left. When I think of the e-bike laws across the US, it paints a picture of patchwork, of really there being very little consistency to what is legalized. It seems very arbitrary. Can you speak to what it looks like across the country in terms of e-bike and e-scooter legalization? And also briefly, if you have seen any similar treatment or conditions of food delivery workers or working cyclists outside of New York City, in other cities, in other states. And if you can do that within 2 minutes, that would be great.
Yeah, so I just have to first say I'm glad that you did not ask me to respond to Dr. Lee or Senator Ramos's comments on defund the police, because, I have to remember that I'm representing Postmates, not Denzel, so I have to stay in my lane. But I will say thank you to both of those comments, as I have been working to educate people like my friends and family on what we mean when we say defund the police. Using terms like reallocation, so that people understand what we're actually talking about, so that we don't sound too radical. So I appreciate you two framing that in the way you did, because I think framing is everything for this conversation. And as people kind of wrap their heads around what we're talking about, using certain words and framing it is going to be important. So I appreciate that.
40 seconds left, Denzel.
Yes, I know, right? In regards to patchwork legislation around the country, I mean, it is that, it's patchwork. I know a lot of jurisdictions realize the issues, but haven't really stepped up like Senator Ramos to address the issues. So again, back to my comment earlier about holding people accountable, I think it's up to Postmates to, again, amplify the voices of our fleet, amplify the voices of our fleet advisory board. And when we hear places like New York that are doing legislation like this, to also kind of amplify that on a larger basis in other places, to show them this is what it looks like, this is what our fleet supports, and this is why. So moving forward, as we continue to engage with folks in different places, holding up New York standard and showing them this is how it's done.
Thank you so much, Denzel. So we are at the top of the hour, and on behalf of Transportation Alternatives, I want to thank the panelists for blessing us with your presence here and your insight. Senator Ramos, Dr. Lee, Mr. Singletary, thank you for joining us, and for everyone who joined today on the webinar, thank you and be well.